Is my brain damaged? This is an interesting question. I work a lot with people with post-traumatic stress disorder, and I help them transcend that because it is an experience that is entirely transcendable. But one of the things that often arrives, I suppose, in the session are certain beliefs that people have picked up around what's going on for them with post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, I'm using post-traumatic stress disorder as an example here, but this could go for any number of other things. Sometimes people internalize the idea that something has happened to them which has led to them being a certain way. This is particularly prevalent within the field of post-traumatic stress disorder. In fact, there is a movement out there to change the name from post-traumatic stress disorder to post-traumatic stress injury. And this idea that it's actually a kind of brain injury is quite prevalent. So a lot of people come to me believing they have a brain injury, and they've often internalized the idea that it's an injury that they will always kind of have to live with, and the best that they're going to have to do is learn to cope with it. Like, for example, if you've destroyed the ligaments in your knee, it's an injury that you can learn to cope with. And this metaphor, this analogy gets brought across. Now, one of the things that I want to say, and I want to make absolutely clear, and I often make absolutely clear to people I work with who have post-traumatic stress diagnoses, is that it is not a brain injury, it is a brain adaptation. So essentially, our brains adapt all the time. It's called learning. We learn things about the world. If a cat jumps up on a hot stove and burns its paws, it learns something not to jump up on hot stoves. But maybe it misgeneralizes. Maybe it learns not to jump up on any stoves. Maybe it learns to avoid the kitchen altogether. In fact, maybe it just stays out of the house. Now, that's not an adaptive response, but it's still a learnt response, and learnt responses occur in the same way. On a neurochemical level, there is a rewiring of the brain to encode that learning. So what we have with post-traumatic stress disorder is a brain adaptation. It is not an injury, it is an adaptation, it is a learning. Now, this is a far more useful thing for people to understand, because when they understand that it's a learning, of course, they recognize, right, I've learned this, then I can learn other things that modify this, or I can unlearn it in a sense, although I truly believe you cannot unlearn things, you can only nuance what you've learned. So let me give you an example of that. If a cat has burnt its paws, and it learns that kitchens are dangerous, it's not going to unlearn that, it's going to nuance the learning to stoves in kitchens under specific circumstances, so its threat response system can become better tuned, right? And this is how with post-traumatic stress, and I'm just using post-traumatic stress as an example here, people can nuance what their brain has encoded so as they can live their lives free from the hypervigilance, the overreactivity, the intrusive thoughts, all of these kinds of things that characterize that labeled condition. So, now, I bring this up as well because I've had other questions come up about brain damage or brain injury. Sometimes we might actually have a brain injury. There might be something in the mix. I've somebody I've been working with recently who talks about having Gulf War syndrome. And there's one rendering of Gulf War syndrome that looks at the idea that there might be certain nerve toxins that have been used that actually damage the brain, cause physical damage to the brain. Now, this may or may not be the case. This is still in the area of hypothesis, but let's assume that it is the case for a moment, that there has been some kind of damage to the brain by a nerve toxin, or let's imagine somebody has a head injury and they've got some kind of damage to the brain. Now, sometimes people internalize this idea of brain damage as in there is damage done. They think that breaking the brain is like breaking, I don't know, I'm looking across, I'm seeing one of my acoustic guitars. It's like breaking an acoustic guitar. And yeah, maybe you can glue it back together and all of this kind of thing. But it's kind of wrecked because it's a solid state thing. But here's the thing, brains are living things with inherent mechanisms for self-healing. within them, and also for rewiring and adaptation. So brains are highly adaptive and highly adaptable. So if you look at somebody who might, for example, have a stroke, depending on how somebody approaches their rehabilitation will depend upon the degree to which they can transcend the injury of that stroke, which might mean actually repair the damage, or it might mean compensate for it, because brains are incredible at doing this. They are neuroplastic, so they can build new circuitry to accommodate for damage done. There's a case I was reading about of somebody who had a disease, I can't think what it's called, that basically destroys the amygdala. It's a pair of twins, actually. They both had the same disease. They both had destroyed amygdala. And one of the twins had no impairment whatsoever from that. And when they scanned them, they found that a different part of the brain had just basically wired itself up to do what the amygdala had done. On the other twin, it didn't. So here's an interesting thing. What's the difference that makes the difference? But one place you can find a difference that makes a difference is if you look at people who have had their brains damaged or injured by, say, strokes. For example, some people approach the rehabilitation with a particular attitude, with a particular mindset, with a particular intent. They want to make massive gains, and they're on board for it. As a friend of mine says, Andy MacArthur, if you want it, you'll get it. So this is a huge thing. We are intent-driven. When we focus, this is when we build brain circuitry. When we look to building capability, this is when we build capability. So brains can adapt like that. Now, some people, they go, all is lost. My brain is injured. There's nothing I can do. And they roll over and they don't engage in the kind of generative activities that are going to build, that are going to repair pathways or build compensatory pathways in their brain. So, all in all, I'm not saying that brain damage as such is not a thing. Yes, brains can be damaged. Certainly in the second case, I really cannot see post-traumatic stress disorder as being usefully categorized as brain damage, though some people do categorize it as such. But yes, there may be other things. It may be head injuries, maybe people have been exposed to toxins or things that have had effects on the brain. But that doesn't stop you being hugely neuroplastic when it comes to your neurocircuitry. You're hugely neuroplastic. It doesn't stop you being a human being, which, as I've said before, is the absolute paragon of learners, changers, growers, and adapters. This is inherent in who we are and how we are. We have incredible capacities to repattern ourselves and repattern our brains to adapt and compensate for all manner of limitations. So, wherever you're at, what I would say to you is recognize that you have this capacity to transform yourself, to transform your brain, literally your neurocircuitry, and know that there is always more than just hope. There is always possibility, and always possibility that can be realized.